Okay, so this is our 7th meeting of the Agriculture Recovery Task Force, and we are going to start out with voluntary updates. Does anybody have updates since our last meeting to share from their organization?
So I do, or sort of, I know I'm sort of semi-embarrassed. I have mentioned, I think it's going on for 8 months now, that FSA is trying to figure out how to compensate farmers for buying additional feed for either feed they lost or quality they lost. Last week I was beginning to want to send John Burge, the director of farm programs, an email saying, is this dead? Because I kept not hearing anything concrete. However, I did hear on Friday that no, it is not dead. They are still working on this. It just emphasizes the fact when you don't have a program that is specifically outlined that says we will compensate farmers for feed, it is incredibly complicated to, one, find the money, and two, find the vehicle. I'm told, as I was told on Friday, that it's not dead. They are still working on, they've identified the money. I do not know how much, and it's national. It isn't just going to be directed to Vermont or New England. And they're just dotting the I's and crossing the legal T's of the vehicle. So that's my update. And I'm sure those of you who've heard me repeatedly cry wolf on this one, I think it's a very small wolf. And I'm hoping at some point to be able to call Anson and say, hey, guess what? We can do something. So that's my update. It's sort of a I don't quite have egg on my face. It may be flying towards my face, but it isn't hit yet. So there we are. That's my update for now.
Thank you, John.
So John, any sense of what the rollout might look like? Because I know I'm going to start getting questions from farmers about this.
Well, luckily farmers aren't part of this conversation.
Yeah.
No, Roy, that's what is frustrating. I think it'll be some kind of voucher program, which FSA has done in years past, before my time in my position. So I don't know. I'm sure it will be, confined to a certain period of time. Did they buy feed within a certain time period? That's what's frustrating, Roy. I wish I could give you more details. And as soon as I can, I will most certainly will, and be happy to trumpet it. And hopefully it's going to help. And even though, I got worried that they were sort of waiting, hoping that it would disappear. But they weren't. No, they've been honestly trying to figure out how to do this without going to Congress, because you can't go to Congress for anything right now that is going to be bipartisan and pass in any sort of reasonable length of time. Everything's sort of dead until after the election. I'm going to be really interested to see how they manage to put a farm bill together. You know, I think we're all going to be interested in that one. But anyway, as soon as I have more details, I will be I will be trumpeting them, as long as they're decent details. Otherwise, I will go wipe the egg off my face. So, okay.
All right, thanks.
Steve?
Thanks. So John, I assume this is just a one-time proposal, or are they actually considering having a different program altogether for disaster relief? Do you know?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure this is one time.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
I'm sure,
Yeah.
you know, that this is, yes, this is just to deal with whatever happened after July of last year.
Okay. Thanks.
Other updates?
So Nicole, I've been approached by and it's easy for me to be approached by Across the Fence. They're interested in having a follow-up conversation with you and I or anybody else on the task force to talk about the 1 year anniversary of particularly the flooding. And I think they're actually looking at July 9 as the date of the flooding, but sometime in July. They kind of want to hear what we've done and what we've achieved, and of course where the recommendations are going, which is really the main point of this meeting. So I think we might have to collect some substance from this meeting in order to have a decent conversation with Across the Fence. Not just Across the Fence, because I've been also having conversations at WCAX that there are lots of ideas and news and worthwhile bits of information that comes out of Across the Fence that doesn't necessarily get into the mainstream news and the mainstream media quickly enough. And so they're looking to kind of merge those two things. And so WCAX has an interest in hearing from us as well. Just wanted to put that out there so that we know that there is a little bit of an accountability thing from not just our news media inside extension, but certainly there's a broader interest in what we do and the outcomes from this.
Yeah, thank you for keeping me on track. I have that on my list as well as like the 1 year anniversary purchase. We really want to be able to identify our action steps, which is obviously what our conversation is today. So thank you for that. John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, because of course that brings, we at FSA, we are still slowly but surely paying out claims from last year from the flooding. We are still doing it, and we will still be doing it. We have had a turnover in one of our most important offices, Lamoille County, Orleans. The SC, the county executive, resigned and went to another job, and this has led to the discovery. I don't really want to pass judgment, but there were things that were not done properly. And now we are correcting those. It will take time. You know, particularly on NAP, which is a very complicated program we have, but definitely benefits mostly vegetable growers, organic vegetable growers. I have no details, so please don't ask me for details, but we actually had a NAP expert in the state over the last week or so, working in Chittenden and Williston area. Well, Chittenden and what's the other county? Washington counties, and hopefully some farmers will be seeing payments that they had given up on because we've figured some things out that should have been figured out sooner. So that's a bit more of an update. You know, so we're, you know, it's just our systems are incredibly complex, more complex than I would like to see them. There is a NAP, and sorry if I, you know, I know what it's like to be in government and we talk in acronyms. NAP is our well, it's basically our insurance program for specialty crops. So vegetable growers in particular benefit from NAP. It's incredibly complex, ridiculously complex. And there is a task force trying to straighten that out for the future, not for the past. And one of the things they are working on is making the crop reporting systems much easier. I hope they will do much more than that, but you know, always remember, I happened to, when I was young, there was a time I was young. I was in the British Royal Navy Reserve, and I once went to we had a demonstration or a presentation about super tankers. And, you know, when super tankers want to turn, it's a decision they have to make 10 miles at least before they get to the point of where they want to turn, because they can't move. And oh my God, federal government is 5 times super tankers trying to turn it. So anyway.
Well, thank you, John. I think that that's a good thing to make note of, though, that that the federal government is trying to make that easier. Because I know that was a very common complaint we heard last year in the flood, that just being able to track the crops and document them properly for NAP was very difficult. So I think that's great. And I think is it Craig that's working for you guys? I think I met him the other day. A very nice guy out there.
I'm not sure that name triggers. Maybe a secret. We've got a secret employee out there somewhere.
Maybe I got his name wrong. I'm sorry.
Don't worry, Nicole.
He knew you. So.
Oh, I know who you met. Yeah,
Okay.
Craig Miner.
Yeah,
Craig
him.
Miner. He's a former employee, but he is working as a crop adjuster.
Okay. Okay, so let's move in, if we don't have any other updates, to talking with each of the subgroups about the feedback. I sent it out to the leads, who did share it with their subgroups. So I'm happy to let's just kick it off. I guess Abby or Nina, do either of you want to start?
I'm happy to start.
Okay.
I noticed that Nina and I are in official matching outfits of the agency today.
I know, I saw that.
Unplanned.
Very sharp uniform.
Thank you, Eric. So I would be happy to report from the Farmer Empowerment Group, which Grace also sits on. Liz Gleason isn't able to be here today. She had a conflicting meeting at the same time. So the conversation that Liz and I had this week was that we have not had the opportunity to assemble the Farmer Empowerment Group, but looking at the feedback on the 3 recommendations that exist in the Farmer Empowerment recommendations, we feel kind of confident in moving forward in one particular area, and we have a strategy for the summer. So that's the piece that I can share, and Grace may have some additional pieces that you may want to also offer. So our intention for the summer is to actually work as a group to establish a roadmap of strategy for how we can do better next time. Essentially, sort of prepare ourselves to be better equipped to respond to an emergency in advance planning mode in anticipation of the next event that's inevitable to occur. And so that's essentially the third recommendation that was in our 3. So that third recommendation is establish a council that focuses on coordinating efforts and planning resiliency strategies for the ag sector. So that's sort of our focus, is sort of how do we kind of assemble learned lessons from what occurred in the 2023 growing season. And so we're having planning to do an in-person day of the Farmer Empowerment Group later this summer to create that action plan, in essence, sort of a preliminary pilot meeting of that council. So while we can't prioritize any further strategies or offer any other feedback or improvements to strategies, changes to strategies based upon the feedback that we received, I think that's our first action item and something that will happen this summer. So Grace, anything that you want to offer from Farmer Empowerment? It's not coming off mute. Okay, I think Grace is going to type something into the chat. So yeah, not that the group's not interested in doing the work and following up on the recommendations. I just think we weren't able to pull together a meeting in the first couple of weeks of June. People have felt pretty busy. So
So Abby, can I ask this?
Yeah.
Is this in-person day some kind of retreat, or it's not that kind of thing?
no, I mean, I think the idea is that we might, it's worthwhile to gather in person if we can, to have some of these important conversations around kind of reviewing the feedback from the 3 recommendations, kind of cataloging what some of our learned lessons were, best practices for kind of preparing for the next need. So again, it's a retreat. I don't know if we use that word yet, but I think the idea is that we would be an in-person gathering. Just want to see what might be here from.
So in the chat, if you hadn't read the recommendations or you hadn't received them, I don't know, like, Ben, you're not in a subgroup, Eric, you're not in a subgroup, so you may not have seen them. So I just posted in the chat the Farmer Empowerment feedback that we got that the group is kind of working from. And I'll do that with the others as well as we go through.
Yeah,
Abby, this
I
is
see.
Marley. I was
Marley.
just wondering, are you planning on just the current members of the group getting together, or are you thinking about adding additional folks?
It's a good question. I think our intent was that it would be the original members of the Farmer Empowerment Group for this first meeting. I think that's why I'm a little reluctant to call it a retreat, because I don't think that we're anticipating that this first meeting is like the entirety of the conversation. It's just the first conversation. On the other hand, I'm not opposed to that group being expanded to other task force members. I don't think that we were planning to reach out to groups outside of the task force at this point.
Thanks.
Yeah, so if you want to join, Marley, let me know. Or if anyone
Thank you.
else feels that they'd like to be a part of that conversation.
I like the idea. I was looking for a kind of sexy word to take back to across the fence. But I also feel, Abby, that there are several people in Extension who might be able to benefit from this or to provide some kind of contribution to
Okay,
this. So if I know when it is, I could certainly try to invite a few people from Extension. But you know all the people in Extension, most of them anyways.
okay. Yeah, maybe what we could do, and again, I'm kind of punting here because Liz and I hadn't discussed this, but what we could do is we could pick the date and time for an in-person meeting that works for the Farmer Empowerment Group, and then share that with this full task force. And if there are folks that within the task force that also want to attend, or staff representation that they'd like to send, I think that would be fine. Again, it's a dual purpose. It's sort of designed to be the first meeting of a group of people starting to develop an action plan and strategy for how to respond. into the future, and also review the feedback on all 3 strategies or recommendations that we received. So it's sort of a working group meeting and kind of an action plan development meeting number 1. Does that sound like a good compromise?
I like it. I really do
Okay.
like it.
Great.
I can't speak for Nicole though. She hasn't answered.
I'm sorry, my computer froze is what happened, but yes, good with that. So I'm thinking it doesn't look like Grace has been able to fix her audio, so I can read her comment in the chat just so folks can hear it. So she said the Vermont Food Security Roadmap, another multi-year project, has tethered climate resilience and long-term farm viability to food security in the state and contains clear, ordered action steps that our work should align with as a starting point for our own farm resilience specific upcoming roadmap of strategies.
Yeah, so that was one of the areas of feedback that came in around, I think, recommendation 2 or 3, sorry.
Yes.
And Abby, let me just throw this at you as well.
Yeah.
Would like to announce, and I'm sure you already know something about this, that the Soil Health Research and Extension Center at UVM is now established and been broadened from what we had before
Yes.
by Joshua Faulkner. So SHREC is up and running, and over time will be even more efficient in doing work with soils and related type of substances. So it is definitely an empowerment issue.
Yeah, it'd be great maybe to hear a little bit more from Josh or even yourself, Roy, about kind of what the New Soil Center has as priorities and is capable of.
Yeah, you could definitely invite Joshua to the gathering or to one of your meetings that you've had.
Okay.
But I'm happy to share with you at any time what I know.
Great, thanks.
Anything else from farmer empowerment at this point?
I don't think so. Yeah, I would just note that I think the pieces that Grace is drawing attention to was that the food security roadmap recommendations had not been made public at the time that we set, hadn't been finalized and weren't public at the time that we set the strategies for the farmer empowerment group. So yeah, there are a series of very agriculturally related components that we do want to kind of bring into the fold of thinking about how do we respond going forward from a food security and viable ag production lens, which I think is really important. So I'm glad that that's a recommendation for consideration.
All right, so I'm going to put the regulatory recovery recommendations and feedback into the chat now and move on to Nina and Marlene.
Good morning, everybody. So similarly, we were not able to pull together a meeting, but we had some good email correspondence around the recommendations from this group in the form of the survey for potential action steps on each of these recommendations. So I have a few updates in each space and some proposed somewhat action steps, but I think there is somewhat of a need to coordinate amongst all of our groups. So I wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to sort of share and listen and hear from you all. And there's definitely a need for ongoing coordination to determine the best path forward here as well. So the first recommendation, which is to grow and enhance investments in agricultural resilience and adaptation. This aligns really well with the first recommendation in the farmer empowerment space. And as I think many of you know, this is sort of comes with the territory of our work to some extent in terms of, seeking additional funding sources. Resilience and adaptation, I think, has been underscored as a continuing gap in funding, specific funding for farms in Vermont. So a couple of updates in this space, and these are really just from our work, you know, our normal work, but things that are happening that I think are aligned. So the first thing I'll mention, which is so the state climate office, which is housed in the Agency of Natural Resources, has submitted a proposal to EPA for climate pollution reduction grant funds. We do have a portion of that proposal for the Agency of Ag Water Quality funding. This is focused on climate mitigation funding. So where there's opportunities to sort of align co-benefits between farm mitigation practices and those practices that also offer adaptation and resilience. I think this is a potential opportunity for additional funding. We won't, I believe, hear back from EPA about whether how the state's climate office has fared in that proposal process until this summer. So we'll continue to update the work group if that's a new funding source available to Vermont and what will be part of that in terms of programming in Vermont. It's not a huge amount of funding for agriculture and for farms, but there is some, so we're hopeful there. There is potential coordination with the Vermont Emergency Management Program, and I know maybe a couple folks on the call are representatives of that organization, but we have a meeting scheduled with Stephanie Smith to discuss the hazard mitigation funding and the potential nexus with agriculture in terms of adaptation resilience. So I think that's a potential funding source. I don't know the details yet because we haven't met, but if there's someone from that organization that wants to chime in and share a little bit about that funding. Yeah, Ben, please feel free to.
Yeah, so Stephanie is one of my direct reports. The state has access to, we estimate, between $80 and $90 million of hazard mitigation grant program or HMGP funding associated with last summer's flooding. We already have pre-applications that add up to about that amount because of all the buyouts. It's a great opportunity to do floodplain restoration, which will increase flood resilience generally. It's a big program, and Stephanie's shop has ramped up a lot to deal with the opportunity. Up to 7% of the HMGP round can be applied to planning projects. And that means that somewhere between $5 and $6 million is going to be available for planning. It'll allow us to improve our next 5-year hazard mitigation plan. It'll allow us to potentially take a run at what they call enhanced plan status, which would qualify us for a larger amount of HMGP for future events, but it's a big lift. But it's really a transformative opportunity to do a lot of good hazard mitigation planning work. And I think that your conversation with Stephanie will be about what do we need to do from a planning standpoint to stand ourselves up for increased future resilience. It is a moment of opportunity.
Ben, do you mind just commenting like timeline wise? So I think somebody connected me with with Stephanie on this topic just in the last week or two. And
yeah, we just
do we have the opportunity to expand and understand whether there's additional funding in this pot for agriculture, or do you think that that's not as likely and it's more going to be buyout focused?
No, I think there is an opportunity within the planning lane. And we just amended the notice of funding opportunity with a pre-application deadline of August 16th.
Okay, thank you so much for adding that update, and apologies I haven't been able to connect with Stephanie before the meeting, but we'll be pursuing that to see about that opportunity. The third sort of update in this space I just want to share is the state of Vermont, one of the programs we manage in water quality is called the Agricultural Clean Water Initiative Program. And we are in the process of awarding a grant to American Farmland Trust. American Farmland Trust received a conservation innovation grant through NRCS Vermont that's actively underway to do whole farm climate adaptation planning. And this is in collaboration with NOFA and UVM Center for Sustainable Agriculture. So this is a really exciting effort underway led by Alyssa White in the state to look at adaptation and resilience planning on farms. We provided additional funding to sort of expand the, I'll say, outcomes of this project. So to increase the amount of farms that they're doing this work with, as well as to expand the communication coming out of this effort. So really looking at, how can we expand more on-farm events, expand peer-to-peer learning, stakeholder events, and some of the reporting that comes from this effort so that we can sort of share the story and better train and equip entities and organizations across the state to do this kind of planning with farms. So right now we have a lot of production-oriented planning and water quality-oriented planning. We do not have planning framework in place for adaptation and resilience. So we're really leaning on this existing active underway effort, which again, it's American Farmland Trust, it's NOFA and UVM who are working with a subset of farms to understand the types of practices and how to do whole farm climate adaptation and resilience planning. So that's the sort of third update area. I wanted to give Marley a minute to speak a little bit. So that's sort of like funding perspective wise. Marley, do you want to talk a little bit about the potential to map inundation areas or any work that ANR has in that space around, looking at last year's flood and identifying priority areas?
Yeah, the GIS folks within DEC are already looking at some of this, but very lightly, obviously, on top of current workload. But it's a main priority, especially with some of the watershed basin planners who are looking at this in their individual watershed areas. Also, NRCS is very interested in this. Nina, you and I have talked about this. John Van Heusen, their GIS specialist, has been working with the UVM Spatial Lab and actually has some preliminary mapping that is starting to look at some of this. So that's really a priority for us, is to try and look at how we can do some predicting of future inundation areas. So I think there's a huge need for some coordination on who can do what, and potentially, perhaps likely some funding for a contractor to help with it.
Thanks, Marley. So I think we don't really have a final action step here. I think there's a lot going on and a lot of organizations who are going to seek funding and, like Marley alluded, do some predictive modeling on areas and the need to communicate that to folks who are working with farms. But I want to give space for others on the team task force, to share any other updates that are underway to seek additional investments and funding for agricultural resilience and adaptation, if there are any you'd like to bring forth just as an update that would impact ag or fit into this space.
And Nina, were you going to talk separately at all about the climate action, the climate subcommittee with NRCS and?
Yeah, the plan, I was going to just mention that as part of the third recommendation.
Okay.
I think that's where it fits.
Hold it off. I guess the only thing I'd say to support what you were just saying was that certainly an action step would be to bring some of these key players together and look at exactly what is available for information and data, what kind of timeline people have and resource space to be putting towards this, and what we might actually need for funding for some type of a contractor. So I think it would be great to pull a core team of like 4 people max into a room to talk about the gaps.
Marley,
Yeah, Ben.
I don't want to get into the weeds of this, and you have probably already run this trap line, but there are several different federal agencies that are involved in inundation mapping, and you want to make sure not to do something that's duplicative, and to confer with National Weather Service, USGS, and other federal partners, even U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, to find out what may already exist for inundation mapping.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think what we'd also like to look at is the direct connection to agricultural activities. Where this mapping exists, how close is it to infrastructure on farms? Where is it in areas where we're already seeing severe erosion on stream banks? Where is it impacting crops, perhaps? So some of it is going to be land cover data as well as the inundation data. But yeah, Ben, absolutely.
we're looking at a super LiDAR application that might be one of the things that competes for HMGP planning money.
This is a great opportunity for getting more LiDAR around the state. Absolutely.
And this may be a use case for that, Eric.
Yeah.
And if there's any other updates on, again, the recommendations grow and enhance investments in ag resilience and adaptation, folks want to share, otherwise I'll move on to the next item. Okay, appreciate the discussion. As I said, we don't have super clear action steps, but there's a lot of updates going on here. So I think we're just trying to get a little bit more organized. In the second recommendation, which is provide clear coordinated education and assistance for farms regarding post-flood regulatory considerations. The survey feedback focused on an emergency landing page or hub of resources, and then mentioned a new emergency management hire. And I wondered if anyone who knew more about that wanted to just speak briefly about that as an update for this whole team, if there is a new ag-related emergency management hire. Or if it was an allusion to what the desire would be that maybe isn't quite realized yet.
I think the person that gave that feedback wants that position to exist, but I'm looking at Eric and Ben. I have not heard in our recovery meetings that said person is coming.
I know nothing.
Okay. I didn't know
know
either,
that.
so I just figured I'd ask.
Nina, it's you.
Welcome.
Oh.
Yes, on top of my other jobs. No.
Best way in the world to send Nina someplace else. Thanks, guys.
You're welcome.
I do understand. I will just say, like, I understand the sentiment there, and will say that being a small agency, we don't have. I mean, we have me and we have Ryan who's doing some things and Nina who's doing some things when it comes to recovery and emergency management, and we have Terry. So we kind of piecemeal it together. But in some of the larger agencies, they do have people that are more focused in their positions on this type of stuff. So I understand the sentiment there, and I think as a government agency, we should definitely talk internally about how we can kind of have point people more so than we do now. That might be helpful.
There is a new position that was just hired in the Climate Action Office at A&R, Working Lands Resilience position. Maybe folks were thinking that was something else. There will be some ag part to that, and we're all kind of coordinating on, at least internally at A&R, and will be certainly with the Agency of Ag about who's doing what, where, and when.
Helpful. Thank you.
Thanks for those updates, folks. I was hoping folks could fill in some gaps there. So in terms of potential action steps and potential ideas, I think there's a lot of interplay here with the government systems recommendation for creating additional emergency response capacity. So we're curious to see where folks see that going and what action steps they anticipate pursuing there. I think the biggest question is that effort planning to focus on developing, a quick response team and the associated training needs, because this is really sort of linked really closely to that. At the same time, we have an active webpage that's still live with a lot of the materials that were developed that I hope will serve us for the next time this happens. But some additional ideas that have been brought forth are, there are some needs to increase education around floodplains and managing debris. That's been ongoing, still is this spring and early summer as folks get ready for the season and prep fields. And also an idea to survey farms around what was missing as part of flood recovery guidance. So no plans of how or who or what the resources are to get these things completed, but I think some good discussion around what potential next steps might look like. And I'm just going to hop right onto the third one because I know we're taking up a lot of time here. So the third recommendation is to create an interagency working group with the Agency of Ag, A&R, and NRCS to develop climate change resilient stormwater best management practices to reduce risks, especially to waste storage capacity. So this is a really, I understand it's a recommendation we've got in our task force. It's a very big question. And I think I can't underscore how big of a question this is because it's very tied to how we regulate farms federally and how we look at agriculture and CAFO and all these different approaches to regulating farms. So in terms of updates, there wasn't any survey feedback specific to this effort. I think Marley and I are probably the closest to it on a day-to-day basis. We have a tentative suggestion as part of the, so the Natural Resource Conservation Service State Technical Committee has a subcommittee focused on climate. So they just got all this IRA funding. They're trying to make sure that we can get that money out the door. So we have sort of as a technical recommendation in this climate subcommittee to State Tech have recommended the creation of a sort of short-term manure management subcommittee that includes both state and federal engineers to look at manure management in Vermont and really in the face of climate and increasing storm events. So I think our action step is to sort of confirm this effort gets prioritized within the NRCS State Technical Committee. And then I think Marley and I both have some internal work to do to sort of prepare our teams and our respective agencies to engage further in this discussion. Do you want to add, Marley, there's a lot more context of the climate subcommittee that I'm not going into detail about that are very exciting things. This is just one component of it. But I think when we think about stormwater practices, we're talking about working really closely with NRCS. So this is a good step forward in that space.
I'm just gonna ask quickly so that we don't get acronyms lost. Does everybody on this call know what CAFO is? Good. Okay, go ahead.
Marley, do you want to?
No, that's good, Nina. Yeah, spot on. This is something we have talked about with that climate subcommittee for quite some time and with the engineers at NRCS, as well as with the regulatory and stormwater folks at DEC. And everybody has a different definition. Nina's absolutely right. You can't possibly document how large a challenge this is going to be, but the idea is to try and get everybody on the same page of stormwater being consistent and keeping as much clean water as possible out of manure pits, barnyards, everything else to help farmers address that in storm water periods or storm flood event periods. So it's definitely a priority for Nina and me and for our teams.
Yeah, Eric.
Nina's item number 2 regarding communications, really, it felt to me in the broader recovery plan. There is an item that is essentially a communications audit that was brought forward by the ANR related committee, infrastructure committee. And I have heard people say things that rhyme across a bunch of different task forces and groups. And yesterday I had a brief conversation with Ella Casey, the chief marketing officer. And I said, you know, we really need to find a way to capture the best communications materials on best practices and emergency response. And, you know, there were these deficits in the moment when the disaster hit, where we just didn't have the right piece of paper or pixels to put in front of people. And so what you just said, Nina, got me a little bit excited, in a good way. I don't know what the fulcrum of this whole process is, but I want to try and have some kind of coordination between all of the different entities so that we have some brand consistency and are using the right small words to communicate with people. And so I just wanted to raise my hand and say, if there are any conversations like this, if I could lurk on the periphery to try and cross-pollinate between the different efforts, I'd appreciate that.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to hear that's front and center in emergency management, as I imagine that it would be coming out. It's a lot of work that went in. Sometimes the best stuff happens overnight, you know?
Oh yeah, oh, I know.
So there's a lot we can lean on from last year's process. And I just hope, I remember sort of the first few days, everyone sort of digging through their emails, trying to find everything that came from Irene. And it was like, you know, it was literally digging through emails and saying, I know I have this document we created to do this and this and talk about feed testing. And so I think there does need to be an effort to sort of compile and store some of the really crucial informational messaging so that it's ready when disaster strikes.
Yeah.
And I think Nicole, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I worked on the CERC team at the health department during COVID, and they, you know, are just lousy with awesome communications people and can really pull stuff like that together very well. but I think we need to have that across all entities to promote good behavior
And
in
Nicole, I
response and
think
mitigation.
one thing for us to just keep an eye on is it hasn't been discussed, but at some point we may be asked if our web page is going to be taken down. And so we'll just want to monitor and make sure that we sort of create a housing location for all of the materials, even if they're not sort of updated for future emergencies. I haven't heard anything to that effect, but I just anticipate that at some point we might get asked if we can remove that from our website.
Okay.
And what will
Okay.
stay over time versus all of the guidance that's currently there for immediate response.
Yeah, I'll chat with Scott about that. Just wanted to give you the opportunity, Jake. I see that you left some comments in the chat. Is there anything that you wanted to speak to?
Sorry. No, I think, I mean, I think what I posted there is, yeah, really just a reminder, and kind of with what Grace was saying too, is like, I think we do have scattered across different reports and plans, you know, some really developed and thoughtful strategies, recommendations for resilience and adaptation that, you know, we should just look to, reference, and account for, as we continue to look ahead and you know, plan for the future. So, you know, I think there's a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders who've been involved in these processes and put some really deep thought into, you know, what would be helpful for agriculture for resilience and adaptation. So, I think, yeah, just recognizing that, and that there is, you know, through the climate action plan process right now, you know, an opportunity to further integrate and further kind of clarify what will be most helpful for farming and agriculture as it relates to climate and resilience. So just also putting that out there as well, that like there's something happening right now that we should be, you know, just attentive to, and trying to ensure as best we can that that integration continues to happen. Yeah, and I would say I'm saying that too as a member. As a member of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, and Marley, yeah, there's some folks here on the committee as well. So yeah.
Thank you, Jake.
I just got to add a piece here really quickly. You know, I think the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, compared to a lot of the other committees that came from the climate action planning process, have continued to emphasize adaptation and resilience in a way that the other subcommittees maybe didn't. And I hope that that message is deeply understood by the whole Climate Council as part of this re-envisioning, in a way that it really, you know, it was very mitigation focused. And I know many of you advocated for it to expand to adaptation and resilience. So I hope that the appetite is there for the climate action plan to expand into that space. I think it's a really crucial nexus to these discussions.
That's true in the Rural Resilience Working Group as well. Focus on adaptation.
Okay. So I'm going to put the recommendations in for the government systems group. Thanks, Ben. I know that this group did not have a chance to meet, but I thought we could maybe discuss this as a group, and I'll let Steve kick us off if he's got any preliminary thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. We decided the government's flawless and our work is done.
Brilliant.
So yeah, no.
I'm gonna cut that from the record.
Well, our
I'm just
job
gonna
is to
mute
turn
myself.
that. Our job is to turn that super tanker, and we're a long way out. And sadly, I'm very sorry to our folks in the Government Systems Committee. I didn't send out the recommendations until last night. But what we need to, the things that we're working on are essentially how to improve federal disaster relief and how to build internal and/or our partner capacity, which are both you know, we're a lot further than 10 miles out on that, although it is part of the action plan from NASDA already, the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. It's something we submitted last year. It's something that really ought to come in the Farm Bill, which, as John already pointed out, is you know, a never-ending battle to try to get any sort of unanimity on anything, although Farm Bill used to be relatively straightforward. So how we go about doing that remains to be seen. We've got to get together and as a group and meet and talk about what we sort of want to focus our efforts on. But certainly I would think our congressional delegation, as well as NASDA, as well as working with FSA and NRCS and our partners on just how can we make the current systems better. Because my basic perception is that at least on the ground in the immediate aftermath, there's really $0 available to farmers who aren't insured either through the NAP program or through private insurance, and everything else is really a low interest loan. And as helpful as those can be, those aren't really meeting the need. So we have to see if we can come up with a different program that could be more responsive, at least to those folks who need it, or perhaps changing the current insurance structure, because private insurance arguably could meet the need if it was structured better. Right now, in my view at least, insurance doesn't come close to meeting the existing need, and so it's a lot of farmers don't buy it for that reason. So sorry, I mean, we need to get together and talk, but anything that we're going to be able to do is going to take time. And John and I think Sarah and Marley, I believe, are all in that group if anybody wants to pitch in. And I apologize for not getting those recommendations out sooner.
Any thoughts about, I'm looking at Steve and John here, about having maybe a discussion at one of our side meetings, or inviting some folks to be part of that group that are from, you know, congressional delegation, like Michelle, or, you know, somebody from Welch's office, somebody from Sanders' office. I don't know if we want to bring them into this conversation.
I think it'd be great. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, sorry.
I see
Yeah,
the
I
wheels
think
turning.
you have to bring them in. I mean, you know, just another part of this whole NAP task force that is looking. At one point, I shouldn't say we. There were a lot of people who were interested in whole farm revenue as a possible way of simplifying and looking at the whole insurance for farmers structure. And this task force has, I gather, given up on that because it requires congressional action. And that's not going to happen until we have a new Congress. Yeah, I mean, and it is the congressional people who have who need to know the problems. And of course, I need to preface this by saying I am not lobbying. Who need to know the problems so that they can provide the solutions. And luckily, well, whichever way you want to look at it, at least we know who our congressional representatives are probably going to be in the next Congress. Unlike many other states, for better or worse, we know. So yes, I certainly think that having a non-recorded discussion with them would be a good idea.
Okay, so I'm going to write that down. We'll set it as an action step. I would love to, you know, Steve and I can talk offline, but I'd love to get a meeting scheduled prior to July, prior to the anniversary, prior to, you know, talking again with the media, so that we can at least have, you know, a clear summary of what we have given them for feedback.
Let me jump in really quickly, Nicole.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of a question for Sarah Waring. Maybe about a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years now, I don't remember, Sarah. You invited me to one of the meetings of the Community Funders Network. And I was just wondering whether there are skill sets or any kind of planning synergy from that group that can be brought to bear on some of the challenges we have here. I remember sitting back and listening to all that was happening there and thought, oh, this is a great group of people. And even if they're local, I wonder if there's a global synergy that we could actually take from that group and bring to bear on what we're trying to do here as well. I hope the question isn't kind of too vague, but
No, I got it. So for everybody else, and Mary and Eric know this because we've talked about it a lot in our interagency recovery coordination group. There is a group of philanthropic federal and state agencies, as well as sub-grantors like VHCB and others, called the Collaborative Funders Network. It convenes usually once a quarter, and during the pandemic, we convened every month. During the flood, we convened about 4 times on specific topics. We have another meeting coming up this quarter. Collaborative Funders Network, right? And the structure is really designed every time by the steering committee, but a lot of the ideas, whether they're in the farmer empowerment world or they're in the federal or the government coordination subgroup, could absolutely be brought up to that group. It is not structured as of yet to create match funding opportunities for federal and state investment, though that is the goal. And one of the things we're hoping to do is to learn from the Texas Rural Funders Network and the Kentucky Rural Funders Network, both of which took off a bit after natural disasters in those 2 states, because they actually collaborate on specific projects, and the philanthropic entities stand up match money to state and federal resources that are invested in communities. So that's a long way of saying, yeah, I think it's a great idea.
thanks for expounding on that. I totally got the name wrong. That community is collaborative.
I'm gonna speak for Grace again. Sorry, Grace, I feel bad that your microphone doesn't work. So she said, just really want to bump this idea for that conversation within June if possible. I was not on the government group, but it came up so much in the moment and was persistent in my mind as simple and actionable. The issue would be how much to ask for, which would take some planning to get right, but we could still straightforwardly advocate to federal delegation for a block grant to be granted to the state to be on hand in the event of emergency that can be doled out to nimble community organizations or given out through the agency's BGAP program.
I mean, I think the one thing that the government group is going to have to wrestle with a little bit is how much of that group's work will be focused on the federal actions that can or cannot be taken with additional appropriations and a structure for those actions versus how much of the group's recommendations and time and energy will be spent on the evergreen resources that exist at NRCS, FSA, RD, and the state agencies as pass-through grants from folks like EPA to coordinate internally, regardless of whether or not there are additional appropriations. And I think that division between thought processes and therefore recommendations is going to be really how we break apart that next conversation whenever it happens.
Mary?
Yeah, just just jumping in that I can say this, and I can't say when it will happen. Ben said it, everybody said it. It's highly unlikely that any bucket of money is going to come until there's a disaster supplemental. As everybody is assuming there will be one, we just don't know when that's going to happen. There's very little chance of a special appropriation, but we are all very, very hopeful that a disaster supplemental is coming. Rumor from the Hill is that that might not happen till January, which is disappointing. But if we can get everybody ready to take advantage of those funds, that would be ideal, right? It could happen sooner, hard to say, but that's the latest rumblings that we're hearing.
Thank you.
Mary, what's the usual ballpark amount for these supplementals? I never know what they are likely to be.
I mean, it's all over the place. So I will say this. It's not just CDBGDR, right? When they do a disaster supplemental, all of the agencies who provide disaster support get a little piece of something, and they use it to bump up their existing programs and have extra funding available. So it's all over the place, and it's all, whatever time period they use, it's going to be that group of disasters that happened within that time frame. So you have to realize you're competing with the Lahaina fire in Hawaii and a multitude of other events, right? The good thing is you didn't have any massive hurricanes in your time frame. So the last supplemental was all disasters that had an incident start date up to December 31st of 2022. So it's going to be anything that happened starting January 1st of 2023 through whatever cutoff date they use. And it'll be a bucket of money, and it'll be sorted out across those disasters. And usually it's pretty substantial. There used to be a time when they didn't always do a supplemental for every year's worth of disasters. And I can say consistently for the last 10 years, it has happened almost every year that I'm aware of, right? So I can't imagine that it won't, but there has been times in the past when it didn't. So it's not guaranteed.
And I'll just add, the appropriations, if it happens, will dictate what federal accounts it goes in. And each of those federal accounts then have rules and regulations. CBDG being the one that is the most flexible because it is passed to the state to run through our existing program. But if, for example, water and environmental program funds are appropriated through rural development, that runs through our existing program, and it is competitive, not on a timeline basis, but just until the money runs out. So Mary's point is really important. Any additional appropriated funds are open for all the states that have had the federally declared disasters, of which there were 26 in 23, I think. So we have to compete for it still.
Sorry, can I ask you to talk a little bit? And sorry if I'm trying to digest all this, but what kinds of projects would that realistically look like in Vermont? Under
What kinds
this,
of projects would what look like?
the CBRG programs.
CDBG, Community
CDBG.
Development Block Grants,
Yeah.
are a HUD account that are a very flexible account, and I can drop the link in just a second, that allow for municipalities and other eligible entities to do bricks and mortar projects, to do all kinds of different, generally infrastructure. Our Agency of Commerce and Community Development manages it. The way HUD does these is that any city, municipality over 50,000 people gets its own CBDG, I always get it mixed up, BDGGG, amount of money. So Burlington gets its own to distribute in the way that they see fit, but the rest of Vermont competes through the ACCD process. And I'll drop that in the link. But that account is not only the one that the congressionally directed spending likes and the earmarks like, but it's the one that rural states use pretty heavily to do a lot of innovative community development work. And I'll find the link so that people can just have that. But like our account under community facilities, our account under water and environmental, we often get an additional little plus up in a disaster appropriations bill under technical assistance in some categories, right? So yeah, so it really depends what the states are advocating for from Congress and where they put the money.
I'm going to tag on just a little bit to what Sarah said. That chunk that Burlington gets, right, and that the rest of the state gets, that's regular CDBG.
Right.
CDBG DR is specific to the disaster, and it's going to be a chunk. It's usually a substantial chunk. Incredibly flexible. The state has to write a CDBG DR action plan to lay out what they're going to do with that money, and usually they do it in coordination with the impacted communities. I've seen it used for all kinds of things, to increase housing, to do infrastructure projects, in one state it was used to build a casino because it was going to promote economic development, economic recovery. And I mean, it can be used for anything. It also loses its federal identity when it's allocated because it becomes state funding. And so it can be used as match against other federal program funds, which is a really big deal. So if you weren't confused before, right, even more confusion.
I'm blown away by the casino thing. I'm just totally blown away.
Do we want a Montpelier casino? Is that what we're looking at?
You need housing, right? You need housing.
The rotating casino on the roof of the apartment building, right?
Can I ask one additional clarifying question? Sorry, I really appreciate this information. I'm sure many do. So I'm just picking as much knowledge from you both. It sounds like it's primarily like municipal infrastructure related to some extent. Do you see a nexus with agriculture or an opportunity that you've seen examples from other states? I mean, obviously housing benefits our farms. If they can house workers and have workers, like we understand that is a huge priority in the state, but I'm just curious if there's other nexus of this potential funding in agriculture that you see, or if we'd have to really create a new space.
So again, I think that's the distinction. What Mary just said is really important. The distinction between the regular evergreen programming that the state already has protocols and procedure for versus a CBDGDR disaster, right? The disaster piece can include whatever the state wants it to include because it is additional and is designed to respond to a disaster. The regular funding is run through this program that I linked. And yes, it is community development focused because that has always been the goal of that regular funding. The disaster would rely on the priorities that the state sets to use that money. So there is an opportunity.
Yep. And if there's an interest, we can find examples of how other states have used CDBG DR funding for agriculture related projects. If that's something like you guys would have to advocate with the state, right? ACCD is still going to get that money and still be responsible for writing the action plan in coordination with HUD. If you want a piece of that, you're going to have conversations with them to talk about, a project that you want added into that or whatever, right?
Abby, do you know if I mean, you and Grace have alluded to the BGAP gaps, but do you know if that's already under discussion for CBRG funding, additional BGAP funding? Sorry, the acronyms are killing me now, but
I don't know if Commerce has been thinking about that.
Sarah, I see you put the link in there and I promise I'll look on my own, but just in case you already know the answer to this, which you undoubtedly do, is there a definition for community in the term community development? We often talk about the farm community, but obviously I'm sure it's not that broad based, but is community a municipality of a certain size, or maybe it sounds like in this DR money, we can define our own communities?
So I will attempt to answer that, but I'll be brief because I see that Mary's also nodding and she's got more familiarity with it than I do. In the general regular, community development block grants that are federal HUD money, yes, there is a definition of community and it relates to HUD's definitions. However, again, it is a pass-through grant that allows the state to add or, modify various criteria. So the HUD, the USDA-RD, various other federal granting entities use census tract and use municipality, right? So like that's our general go-to structure for the word community. Then there are all kinds of criteria embedded under that in terms of size and scale and historically disadvantaged or tribal community or coal community or whatever, right? Mary, maybe you are better positioned to answer that when it comes to the DR funding, whether or not you can tweak the underlying HUD metric of census tract municipality.
Yes, there is way more flexibility with DR, and the state has to, again, write their action plan, and then it's up to the state, as long as HUD approves of the plan, to define what a community or an area or a region that a project is going to be supporting fits, right? So it's kind of built into the plan, what that territory is, what a community is. You can define your own definition of that.
Great, thanks.
I'm gonna ask one more question. I'm terribly sorry, and then I'm gonna stop asking questions. So when you say the state, Mary, and the priorities that the state puts forth, you're really talking about Vermont economic development, because that's where this HUD money goes through to some extent.
I mean, yes, they have to write the plan, but
Yeah.
it's bigger than just a single department or agency in the state, right?
Yeah,
It's
but
more.
they would probably be the leads, like from our end,
Yes,
working with
yes,
the state. Okay.
yes,
Just trying to get my
yes.
head wrapped around that. Thanks. Sorry for the questions.
The link is a very broad overview from HUD's website. I'm also looking for, I have a PowerPoint that gives a pretty good, simple explanation of what it all means, and I'm trying to find it. So let me see if I can get you that. Didn't find the PowerPoint, but I did find an older fact sheet that is a pretty basic explanation. May be helpful. Oh, I can't upload to state teams. Sorry, guys. I can email it.
That would be great. Thank you.